In today's video, I want to talk about delusions. Now, what is a delusion? Because in daily life, I've noticed that people call others delusional when they just don't agree with their viewpoint, or because they don't want to consider the viewpoint of the other. Now, what is a delusion? And what is a delusional individual? Because you can call almost anyone delusional if you frame it the right way. The right way if you want to lie, I mean. Narcissists do this all the time. They call others delusional just to discredit just to break down their credibility. And it often works because people don't even know what a delusion is. Now, what is a delusion? Now, I'm going to explain a fantasy and delusion because they are similar but they're not the same. A fantasy is when you long for an outcome without considering all that relates to the outcome. For example, if someone wants to build a house and they also want to have their own share in the local economy so that they can participate in the community, so they can finance the protection of their house. Now, that's not a fantasy. Even if they have zero money on the bank account, they want something, but they also consider all that comes along with it. They don't just look at their wallet, they look at the bigger picture. But let's say someone wants a house and just want to have a house, purchase a house, or build a house. They don't want to be left alone. It's their house. That's a fantasy. Why is that a fantasy? Because that house is located somewhere. And anyone can break in and steal from that house. The only reason you can have a house somewhere and nobody breaks in is when the community agrees that is Kevin's house or that's Julie's house, so don't come there. The community must be in agreement that it's your house. Let's say you live in a neighborhood where people have racial attitudes and an Indian guy comes around and he purchases a house. Sooner or later, people will break in, people will commit arson on the building, and the rest of the people don't care because they don't want the guy there anyway. Even though on paper it's his house, in practice, the community needs to be in agreement with what's on paper. Or else in practice, in reality, he can't remain in that house for long. So you as a human being, you are a vulnerable creature also. You should remember that. So when you remember that, as you remember the bigger picture and you consider what you want carefully, that's how you ought to be. But a fantasy is when you want something and you don't want to consider the bigger picture at all. That's a fantasy. A delusion, listen to this carefully, a delusion is when someone is frustrated and they desperately want an outlet or they want relief. And once they see a potential relief, they cling on to it. And they don't want to hear anything from anyone that may question the outcome that they're clinging on to. That's a delusion. So a fantasy is just that you don't consider the bigger picture. In a delusion, you're so frustrated that even hearing anything that challenges the outcome you're clinging on to, you become the enemy of whoever is giving that view, opinion, or you become the enemy of anything and anyone that challenges the outcome you're clinging on to. So a fantasy is easily broken down when you're in practice. For example, someone wants a house, but they don't consider all that comes along with it. Not only does you need the so-called consent of approval from the community, but with consent, I don't mean that you need to ask permission to live somewhere. With consent, I mean people need to get through that it's your place, you're living there. Okay? Well, let's say someone wants a house and they finally get the house, but they have no contact with the neighborhood at all. Sooner or later, that fantasy will break down and they realize, you know what, I need to be involved with the community. Because if someone tries to break into my house, it's a community that will alarm the police when I'm not around. So I can't be separated, I can't be like a hermit and expect things to work out for me. Okay? So a fantasy is easily broken down. But a delusion is completely different. Let me give an example of a delusion. Someone is frustrated in life because he's disappointed. And he just wants things to work out for him. He wants to be left alone. But in daily life, you need to interact with other people. And other people tend to have issues. So, realistically, you need to learn how to deal with people and also accept that you live in a fallen world and people in general tend to have issues. Because you live in the world. Let's say this guy doesn't want to deal with all of that. He just want to be left alone. So he's in a conflict now. He's in frustration. Tensions are building up. And then one day, a crime is committed and they point the blame on a guy. Let's call it guy that the blame is pointed upon Jeffrey. And I said the guy that wants relief is Frank. Now Frank hears that Jeffrey might have done it. And let's say Frank hears all about how terrible the crime was. And being emotionally affected, he decides, you know what? Jeffrey did it, he needs to be punished. He gets so convinced that Jeffrey committed the crime, that Jeffrey raped and killed that girl. And when some of his relatives tell him, Frank, you're so convinced that this Jeffrey did it, but his DNA was not found on the crime scene. Also, he was in a town 200 kilometers away when the victim died. That alone should reveal that Jeffrey didn't do it. But now, this Frank is so convinced it's Jeffrey. Why? Because now he has someone to project his frustration on. Jeffrey is the bad guy and he needs to be punished. Jeffrey needs to be hung. Jeffrey needs to be executed. And by now, meditating all that rage onto Jeffrey, he's relieved from having to face himself and face his own wrong attitude. Now, this Frank is in a delusion. And the moment he keeps hold on to that delusion, he becomes a delusional individual. People that are in a fantasy, when they encounter reality, 95% of the time they adapt. Even though it may be difficult for them because they get used to all the other things they didn't consider, but they adapt. Someone that's delusional has sworn off reality. They have sworn off the bigger picture. They have sworn off their responsibilities. They have a militant attitude against anything that demands them to be responsible. So, someone that's in a delusion, when you mention the facts, they will attack you, or they will try to make it appear as if you're crazy. That's what they do. Now, just because someone is desperate doesn't mean they are in delusion or that they're delusional. You can be desperate for a solution and you encounter a solution. So that desperation is positive. You can be desperate in knowing the ways of the Lord and how to walk by faith. The desperation of the delusional individual is a completely different kind. That is not the desperation of the delusional individual is a narcissistic desperation. It's the desperation of wanting relief at all costs, holding on to your will no matter what. Look, a delusion is often factual. Let me repeat it, a delusion is often factual. If you tell someone that you want to have access to the internet without charging your phone, you would say, dude, you need to go see a mental health professional because a phone is an electronic device and you need electricity on it to work with it, and the internet works through electricity. Now, something like that is obviously out of the blue. So you can't have a delusion based on something like that. But you can have a delusion based on facts and people who want to look beyond the facts. Remember in the parable, you had this Frank that agreed that Jeffrey was the killer. There were some facts that hinted that he was probably the one that did it. And he also was dumped by the victim, and the victim cheated on him. So everything appeared as if Jeffrey was the one. But if you would have looked at the bigger picture, you would realize it couldn't be Jeffrey. Okay? Now, a delusion can only work if there are facts involved that are true. Because if there are facts involved that are true, the individual can easily cling on to those true facts and they can come up with an excuse that those facts are real. That's why they don't have to look at anything else. I hope you understand now the difference between a fantasy and a delusion. A fantasy is shattered sooner or later. A delusion gets worse and explodes. So you don't have to bother that much with a fantasy. It's a delusion you should be aware of. And how do you deal with people that hold on to a delusion? How do you deal with delusional people? You don't deal with them. You avoid them. You especially don't trust them. Straight up, you don't. Someone that has a fantasy, you can guide them to the facts, and eventually they'll see the bigger picture and they comply. People always think it's fantasies that are dangerous. No, it's delusions that are dangerous. But most people don't see the difference between a fantasy and a delusion. Some people are in a fantasy because they were not well informed. Okay? So when they are better informed, they adapt. But someone that's delusional, they're not into any information. They just want redundant validation. And once they don't get the redundant validation, they lash out. They attack. They're upset. They're hurt. And it's your fault that they are hurt. So know the difference between a delusion and a fantasy. Well, that's it for now. Keep agreeing with Christ and be at peace.